Tasmanian Amateur Cine Society started, I think, just after the end of the Second World War. I came to Hobart in 1963 and made inquiries about a club and found that the club was in existence and meeting in Warwick Street. Well, I suppose what attracted me to it was the fact that it was the only club in Tasmania at the time. I bought a Boltic 16mm camera and a heavy tripod. I knew enough about the setup for providing for the tripod for it. There were people with standard 8 at the time, and some of the club members in those days also had 9.5 Pathy cameras and some standard 8 cameras. Definitely a lot of variation, and of course there were many different types of standard 8 cameras. I don't think there were very many 9.5s, but a lot of various models of standard 8. We were meeting, as I mentioned earlier, at Warwick Street in the basement of the then President's home in Warwick Street, and unfortunately he was in poor health and he resigned the presidency and John Fullerton took over, and we had to leave the President's premises, the past President's premises. But about that time, we saw a notice in the paper for another TACS, which made us wonder what was going on, and we decided that we would go and visit them at their meeting and find out what it was. And Peter Dransfield had a group of young people as a following, and he'd adopted this same title as we had. So we thought it would be a good idea if we combined with them. They had quite a number of young people and no money. We had a few older people and some money, so the combination turned out well. But Peter was a bit of a dynamic man who had a following of people who would go and make films with him. He was always the director. He wrote the film and produced it, edited it, did the whole lot himself, but he had this following that went along with him. Well, the films that he made, I would say, are still in his possession, and I don't know where he is now. He made one that I particularly remember when we first joined them. It was a sort of a cowboy film made out at Campania in the hotel there, the old Campania Hotel, and it was much to the amusement of the local inhabitants and to the education of our members. Well, it was more or less a pretty abbreviated, tough cowboy film with cowboys mooching into the hotel, into the bar, and throwing back drinks of coloured water and things like that. Yeah. And also he used to grab any opportunity he could. One day he'd been out at Mount St Canis making a film about the nuns. I don't know what the film was included or what the story was, but when they came back into town, these girls were still in their nuns' habits, and there was an American submarine in town at the time, and he decided he'd take the nuns down to have a look at the submarine, And that caused a bit of confusion. The Americans didn't know what to do with these nuns. But one of the things we found when we were looking at his film later, one of the girls had brown shoes and light tan stockings, so we reckoned she wasn't a true nun. His side of the club sort of faded a bit. A number of them stayed with us, but some of his particular followers left us. So that more or less finished the influence of Peter. Yeah, there were others who took his place. One I think of was Roy Good. Roy was always organising films. He had a good contact with young people, and he used to make what I thought were children's films. I suppose that's what he intended. And he made a lot of them. Another one that I remember was The Children, made by Roy Good, concerning a mystery of the disappearance of some children. Called The Children, in which he was an artist in the bush, and he dozed off, and he had a dream of the children surrounding him, threatening him. One of them, I remember, one of the children that he'd befriended came onto the camera brandishing the thigh bone of a steer or something like that, and they were painted with blood around their faces and on their hands and that sort of thing to make it more so. And eventually Roy woke up and there were no children there, but when he looked back to his painting to see where he'd got to, he found that they were in the painting. I think of Peter Davis. He came back from Vietnam and brought with him a Super 8 camera, and he'd been using it over there, and he very smartly got us organised, helping him with films that he was making, and that was good for the club. Well, Little Red Riding Hood sticks in my mind a lot because I was the wolf. We had Roy Good was the grandmother, Jeff Hardwick was the woodcutter, and I can't for the life of me remember the name of Little Red Riding Hood. She was about 6 feet tall and worked in our department, the main roads department, and was a pretty good looking blonde. And one of the things that embarrassed me was at the office the following week, she was bragging to the rest of the typists about the bedroom scene with Mr. Wilson. Yes, about that time, I would say it was in the 1970s, we started a national competition which received entries from all over Australia, and from the prize-winning entries, we each year developed an evening of films which was open to public viewing, and we were lucky enough to get the theaterette, or whatever you would call it, at the Rossney College, and we had the right atmosphere for good films and the right equipment. It was quite good, and we had a very good following of the local people, not only from the Eastern Shore but from all of the Hobart area. Used to come every year. The film nights were popular, and we overflowed the hall really, and they went on. In fact, I can't remember now why they stopped. Yes, when I think of who was making films, of course one was John Gray, who made many winning films, Roy Good, John Bushoten, Carol McGee, Peter Davis. At the convention in Melbourne in 1978, they said it was our turn to have the convention. It used to go round the various clubs round the other states, and it was offered to us, and I was at the convention and accepted the responsibility for running it. Sydney and Melbourne both thought we may have had troubles doing that, and Sydney gave us a cheque, and I can't remember now whether it was 100 or 150 pounds, and Melbourne offered any help they could give us, any help we required. So we went along happily with that. In the event, we didn't have very much help from Melbourne, but I think it was better that we didn't. We stood on our own feet. Just before the main organising of the convention began, we had a split in the club. One of our solid members, Graham Klingleffer, and his wife got upset because Graham hadn't been selected as one of the committee for the convention, and his wife said but he'd have to come to every meeting because she couldn't drive, and so they both withdrew from our club and started one of their own. This was a bit embarrassing at that late stage, but I approached the two of them and asked them, with the club that they'd just formed, would they join our committee to run the convention. So that eased their feelings a bit, and we got on with it. And I'd say that the convention was a vast success. We think, or I think, that we managed the competitions very well. We had a good crowd of judges and a good crowd of people to sort things out, and that went very well. And nearly all of the Hobart possible attendees complained that we'd chosen the most expensive venue in Tasmania, and some from the other parts of the state felt the same, but in the event the visitors from the other states all congratulated us. They reckon it was far better than they expected. we found that gradually video cameras were coming into the club, and I think this led to some falling off of membership, because one of the things was, if you wanted to do video, you had to have the right equipment. And some of us didn't have the time to learn to use it, others of us didn't have the money to do it, and so they felt that they weren't in the race of keeping up with the people with video cameras and equipment. And of course, I particularly think of Werner Stadler, who seemed to have the best of everything, 2 or 3 computers, and I suppose tape recorders and players. And he in my book, had the ideal setup for video equipment, and then gradually more members got it. I think making a film is making a film, whatever you've got to do it with, and therefore there's not a great deal of difference. The electronic stuff has made it so much easier to do what you want and the way you want to do it, whereas editing, etc., with the ordinary movie film was a difficult process. And then, of course, the most difficult of all was getting the sound in sync with the film. We used to have all sorts of mechanical contrivances to hook to the projector, really, to drive the tape at the same or the required speed for the projector. The club hasn't had its own club rooms, but there are a few things that I do know about. Before I came down from the West Coast in 1963, the club used to meet in the, I think it was the upper floor of a service station at the junction of Murray and Bathurst Street, diagonally opposite the State Library. And it was after that that they moved to John Valance's basement up Warwick Street. And then we went to the Child Mining Centre in the centre of town. I'm not sure of the sequence now, but we went to the university and in the arts building there, and used to have our suppers in the staff canteen or whatever it was. We joined Martin King, or Martin King joined us. I'm not sure which was which, but Martin was a great influence on us, and he had Rent-Light Studios in Lansdowne Crescent, and he offered us the use of his premises there, and he had done a bit on movie making, and he'd been I suppose you'd say an actor and a stuntman, and he knew about music. He knew a bit of everything, I think, to do with movie making, and he didn't ever hesitate to help us with things and advise us about things, and it was quite a good home. It was just a pity that we couldn't have continued up there. Before I came to Hobart, the club was fairly large, but I found out later, because I lived in the same block as John Viney, who was in the club about 1962, And a difference of aim developed. Some of the newer members wanted to make films and play with sound and that sort of thing, whereas the older members thought it was more important to learn to make films before they started to learn sound. And the feeling was so intense that they split. John at the time was into playing acting, and well, he used to be a lighting director for one of the amateur play groups in Hobart, and he belonged to the east side, the Riverside Arts Group, I think they called themselves, and he invited these disgruntled members of our society to go there, and they formed a film group of the Riverside Arts Club. And seeing that I wanted to learn as much as I could about films, I joined them also. And we made a film called The Gogglebox Burglar, and I was in it, behaving a bit idiotic, and my young daughter, or the eldest daughter, she was young at the time, she also took part. And they were a fairly active group, but unfortunately the fellow who was their president or chairman or what they called him, he died, and so the whole thing seemed to fade away. They had another active member who was a bit of an author and playwright and that sort of thing, and she wrote a few things, and in fact one of the groups that she led made a film of the history of Hobart, which I thought was pretty good, starting with Van Diemen and Abel Tasman, and then going through the whole lot. We had shots down where Bowen had landed, and shots at Narina and that sort of thing, and it was put together, and in my book it turned out very well, but it was the other group, not the tax. Well, of course, as regards the modern films, I feel that it's so much easier to make a film now, but it doesn't mean that they're so much better. We used to see some very good films made on standard 8 film, Super 8 film, 16mm film. This projector was used many times by the club for projecting our club films to public demonstrations when we were allowed to use the auditorium at the Rosny College. We could set this up in the buyer box at the college and throw the picture to the screen right at the front of the auditorium. It has a couple of lenses, the one that are used for normal projection, and the other, which was a longer focus zoom, which was used for the larger theatres. When I got this projector, I tried to get the electronic components to do a bit of smart stuff with us, and Kennedy's in Melbourne, who were the agents for them, told me that the quality of the electricity in Tasmania wasn't good enough, and I knew that was rubbish. So I wrote to Japan, and I got what I wanted free of charge. When I first joined the society, most people had standard 8 or just 8mm cameras. Some, the richer ones I suppose, had 16mm, and at least one had the French 9mm camera. The 9mm differed from the others. It had the perforations down the centre, and so the picture on the 9mm film was about the same size as the 16mm. When the Super 8 camera came out, they were very simple at first, but the main thing about them was that they had a Super 8 cartridge which contained the film. You bought the cartridge, put it into the camera, did your filming, took the cartridge out, put it in a container to send off to Kodak's for processing. In those days the processing was done at Melbourne. The only legacy from the club that I'm aware of is the continuing friendships of members, past members, new members. Yes, and the fact that we get invitations, I get, and other people like me who are a bit old get to come along for Christmas parties and that sort of thing.